Excuse me. We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Today we have an overview of the Legislative Auditor's evaluation of the Minnesota teacher licensure. And I want to welcome Ms. Randall to the committee. Ms. Randall, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division, and I'm pleased to be back here in front of your committee, this time now talking about Minnesota teacher licensure. This is an evaluation we released last March, and as you all likely know, there was and Mr. Chair, you were on the study group that looked into our findings and recommendations during the interim and came out with a report. So I'm pleased to provide the overview of our findings and recommendations from last year. I'm going to just kind of cut to the bottom line and tell you that we found a lot of problems with Minnesota's teacher licensure system. And we found those problems really at all levels of the system, starting with the laws, the statutes and rules that use undefined terms, use the terms in contradictory ways. The laws are extraordinarily complex. We had a team of 3 working on this evaluation for 9 months, and it probably took us that long to feel like we fully understood what the laws were intending. We also found problems related to the governance structure that oversees teacher licensure in Minnesota. There are 2 agencies, the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching, both of which have responsibilities related to teacher licensure. They have overlapping responsibilities in some places, and in other places it's unclear who's responsible for what. And then we also found some problems related to the implementation of the teacher licensure process, from when a candidate goes to the website to apply for a license and figure out which license they qualify for, problems throughout, all the way through to the appeals point. So it wasn't good, is the bottom line there. So we had a number of recommendations. Here are some of our key ones. First was to the legislature to clarify the teacher licensure statutes. Last year, the legislature did make some progress in this area. I think there's still some work to be done. I know the revisor's office has been working with folks on that. We also recommend really an overhaul of the teacher licenses themselves, the teacher license structure. In particular, we recommend the legislature considering a tiered licensure system, and I'll get into the details of that a little bit later in the presentation. And then we recommend consolidating all teacher licensure activities into one state agency. And again, I'll talk more about each of these as we go through the presentation. Before I go deeper, though, let me just back up and provide just a quick overview of teacher licenses in Minnesota, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Teachers are licensed for a subject area and grade level, so secondary level math or K-12 Spanish. Elementary school, I guess, isn't really necessarily a subject, but it's certainly a grade level. It's lots of subjects. Teachers can get a different license depending on the extent to which they satisfy the requirements outlined in law. A candidate who meets all of the licensure requirements outlined in law would receive a 5-year full professional license. But for candidates who perhaps haven't passed an exam or who haven't met all of the requirements, there are different versions of the license that will allow somebody to be in a classroom teaching a class. Special permissions are another version. They're not maybe a full license, but it's another way that candidates can be in the classroom teaching. There's also variances and waivers, and you can start to hear the complexity that builds around teacher licensure just when I talk about kind of the overview of what's possible here. And then, as I mentioned, there are 2 state agencies involved in teacher licensure, the Board of Teaching and the Department of Education. In general, the Board of Teaching establishes the policies and the standards for teacher licensure, and the Department of Education is kind of the implementer. They receive the licensure applications, they review the applications, make decisions, notify the candidate of the license they receive, and issue the license. All right, so let me start first by talking about the complexity of the statutes. And one of the things we found contributed to the complexity is that the legislature makes multiple changes to the statutes, and in fact, some aspects of the statutes are changed annually. So for example, there were annual changes when we looked back over the last 5 or so years to requirements related to the qualifying skills exams, There were exceptions made for teachers who didn't pass the exams, and there's also regular changes to the requirements for teacher preparation programs. What all of this change means is that it's difficult for the applicants who are applying to know what's required of them, and frankly, it's even difficult for the licensing specialists at the Department of Education to know what's currently required in a given year. In 2015, I know the legislature heard a lot of concerns about teachers who had been trained and licensed in another state who then moved to Minnesota and wanted to get licensed in Minnesota. And I know Mr. Chair, even his mother, I think you talk about your mother having that situation, having been trained and licensed in another state and coming to Minnesota and having to jump through hurdles to get licensed and be able to teach here. And so in 2015, the legislature made a number of changes to address those concerns that it was hearing. However, what we found is what we think of as maybe an unintended consequence of those changes that took place in 2015, in that now there are two sets of licensure standards depending on where a candidate was licensed. And in fact, in some cases, it is now more difficult for a candidate trained in a Minnesota teacher preparation program to get a Minnesota teaching license. So I'm just going to walk through this slide a little bit. I know it's a little complicated. The red font is intended to show differences between the standards for a candidate trained in Minnesota and for a candidate trained and licensed in another state. And I'll just talk about that second row in particular. So a candidate trained in a Minnesota teacher preparation program currently must have field-specific teaching methods. So they have to have a course that, for example, if they're going to be a math teacher, helps them learn how to teach math. They also have to have at least 12 weeks of student teaching. That's currently the requirements in law for a candidate trained in a Minnesota teacher preparation program. Based on the changes made in 2015, a candidate trained and licensed in another state needs either field-specific training methods or student teaching. And if they have student teaching, there's not a minimum on the amount of student teaching they need to have had. So as part of our evaluation, we sat in on these bi-monthly committee meetings that Department of Education licensing staff and Board of Teaching staff would have to discuss candidates who maybe were outside the norm. And on two different occasions, we saw two different candidates who had been trained at two different teacher preparation programs in Florida. Both of them had completed the training program in that school. Both of them had received a Florida license. They hadn't taught in Florida, and they had 5 days of student teaching. And based on the way the law is constructed, the staff was required to give them a full professional teaching license. If that same candidate had gone through a Minnesota teaching preparation program and had only had 5 days of student teaching, he or she would not receive a full professional teaching license. So I don't mean to harp on this, but it just shows kind of the complexity and the nuances that are currently in place in the state's teacher licensure statutes. So we have a number of recommendations kind of related to this point. The first is to clarify the statutes. Define the terms used, define terms, and use them consistently throughout. Again, some changes were made last session that definitely are a step in the right direction, but I think there's more change that needs to happen. Related to the licenses themselves, we recommend considering a tiered licensure structure. As I mentioned previously, right now there are exceptions to the requirements, there's variances, there's waivers, there's special permissions, there's different types of licenses, and it's confusing. With a tiered licensing structure that we'll walk through in the next slide, we think it provides clearer expectations for candidates of what's expected for them, what they need to do to be able to get a license. It would provide for consistency because there wouldn't be exceptions and different avenues for licensing, but it would also provide flexibility to help school districts, many of which are struggling with teacher shortages that are real. So I'd like to direct you to page 77 in the report, if you have it in front of you. And the report may look like this, or it may look like this, because we have a new cover design. So they're the same report, the content's the same, just the cover is different. So if you look at page, I believe it's 77, that has a more detailed version of the information on the slide. But let me just walk through what a tiered licensure system looks like. And I will just emphasize that the sample system here before you is simply just a sample. It's a starting point. We put it in the report as kind of a proof of concept and to start to get people thinking around this idea. We certainly understand the devil's in the details, and that as you all think about it and ponder it, you would likely want to make some changes. So let's just start with Tier 1. Tier 1 is the lowest level of requirements. Basically, to receive a Tier 1 license, a candidate would need to have a school district or charter school want to hire them, so they'd be requesting that this person get licensed, and then they would have to meet only one of those criteria listed below. And I know as we've talked about this report and we've talked about this tiered system in multiple hearings over the past year, some people are uncomfortable with that because it seems like a pretty low level of requirement. And I understand that, and I guess the first thing I would say is you're certainly welcome to change it. This is simply a starting point. But the other comment I would make is that the current requirements we laid out in Tier 1 is no less of a standard than what's currently in place for candidates who are teaching with under a special permission. So Minnesota already lets people who have that level of criteria teaching students in the classroom. And so Tier 1 simply is kind of a hold harmless at that level. Moving up to Tier 3, I'll just jump up there, that's where we would imagine most candidates would enter the licensure system. Tier 3 would be the standard license somebody would receive if they met all of the teacher licensure requirements currently in law. And then Tiers 4 and 5 kind of just build on that and provide kind of a career development opportunity perhaps for teachers. You know, Tier 5 goes up to recognizing national board certification and additional years of experience. So that's something that we recommend the legislature consider, is moving towards a model like this. Again, it makes it really clear what's expected for folks at each licensure level, but it does give school districts some flexibility to get there. Okay, I'm going to switch now from talking about the teacher licenses and the complexity of them and move to the governance issues related to teacher licensure. So this slide is talking about the governance structure, and it says the lines of responsibility are blurred. And I would just note that that's probably a pretty kind characterization of the situation. We, as part of our evaluation, conducted surveys of all charter schools and school districts in the state. We also conducted a survey of teacher licensure applicants who had been trained and licensed out of state and were applying for a Minnesota license. And we heard from more than 700 of those teacher licensure applicants. We talked to stakeholders, interest groups, probably a number of people sitting in the room and others. And really across every conversation, across all these surveys, the main thing we heard is that the structure is confusing, it's frustrating, it's complicated, there's finger pointing. Basically, at the end of the day, there's really diffuse responsibility or diffuse accountability, and it just ends up meaning that there's very little accountability or transparency for teacher licensure decisions in the state. Statutes contribute to the confusion. For example, statutes state that the Board of Teaching must issue licenses, and statutes also say that licenses must be issued by the Department of Education. Additionally, while the Board of Teaching is an independent board established in law, in practice, it has historically at least received its funding as a rider under the Department of Education appropriation, which limits its independence and ability to manage its own administrative and fiscal issues. So as we dove into this evaluation, the issue of governance kind of bubbled up pretty quickly, and we knew we were going to likely make some recommendations related to it. So we started to look for other models of governance related to teacher licensure. And we looked to see how Minnesota licenses other professions in the state, and we also looked to see how other states license teachers. And across both of those sets of models, we found that the shared oversight system that we have now with the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching is unusual. So first, let's talk about other professions in Minnesota. And if I could direct you to page, I believe it's 91 in the report. Page 91 shows a table of how Minnesota licenses a select group of other professions in the state. And we basically found three broad models. On one end of the spectrum is professions that are licensed really just by an independent professional licensing board. And so on the slide I wrote the health licensing boards because a lot of those boards are the ones that are licensed simply by a board. The other end of the spectrum are those professions that are licensed just by state agencies. And I listed Department of Commerce here on the slide because they tend to license a lot of those professions, things like real estate agents and insurance agents. And then you can see this middle column on this table on page 91, where you have this hybrid, where there's both a board and an agency that's involved in the licensure. And you can see there's not a lot of professions listed there. We've got teaching, we have the school administrators, and then electricity, plumbing, and high-pressure piping systems. So when we look to see how Minnesota licenses other professions, we see that teaching is kind of an anomaly. Then we look to see how teachers are licensed in other states. And if you flip over to page 90, there's a table there that shows the extent to which other states have standards boards to license or oversee their teachers. And again, you'll see that Minnesota teachers are kind of at one end of the spectrum, kind of an anomaly again, in having kind of a more full standards board. While there's no model that has a majority of states under it, the plurality are licensed by their equivalent to the Department of Education. So, we look to see these models, and one says, well, licensing board, and one says, well, Department of Education. So when we went to make recommendations, what we felt the most confident in recommending was to consolidate in one state agency. So our official recommendation doesn't say where to put the teacher licensure responsibilities, but it does say really quite strongly to consolidate all of the teacher licensure activities into one state agency. In the report, we walk through the advantages and disadvantages of putting all that responsibility in the Department of Education or putting all of that responsibility into the Board of Teaching. And ultimately, what we came down to was we thought it was slightly better to put that responsibility into the Board of Teaching. And we came to that conclusion for two main reasons. First, whichever agency licenses teachers is going to be responsible for disciplining licensed teachers who violate the teacher's code of ethics. And we felt that that type of disciplining made the most sense coming from peers in the profession, people who understand what's reasonable and what's not reasonable to do in a classroom. Now, could that be done in the Department of Education? Sure. Could the Department of Education have an advisory board of teachers to help with that? Sure. We just thought it was kind of cleaner and made more sense to have that responsibility in the Board of Teaching. The other reason why we thought putting it in the Board of Teaching was better is related to approving teacher preparation programs. So currently, one of the responsibilities related to teacher licensure is approving teacher preparation programs, which of course are housed in higher education, in colleges and universities. And we felt it was an awkward fit to put that responsibility into the Department of Education that has K-12 responsibility. Now, could that be done? Again, sure, but we felt it seemed cleaner, again, to keep it in a separate board. But again, I just want to emphasize that our primary recommendation is to consolidate these responsibilities into one state agency. That being said, if the legislature chooses to not consolidate into one state agency, we had a couple of other recommendations that we thought would at least help a little. First is to clarify in law which agency is responsible for which activities. I guess that goes back to clarifying statutes. We also think that, again, if you decide not to consolidate, that the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching should have some interagency agreements or something so that not only is it clear in law who's responsible for what, but the two agencies have said, yep, we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and it's really clear who's doing what. And then we also would recommend to the legislature to fund the Board of Teaching directly rather than as a rider under the Department of Education. So with that, Mr. Chair, I think I went quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and that's kind of the nuts and bolts of our evaluation from last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Randall? Ms. Randall, I'll ask one real quick. Back on 77, when you talked about your sample, is there any thought behind this, or is this really just to be more of a as you said, a sample, kind of an exhibit of what something might look like, but not really a hard recommendation on any of the tiers specifically?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I would say, of course, there's always a lot of thought behind whatever we put in our reports. That being said, I don't think there's anything magical about this sample tiered system. I mean, it is a sample, and the way I always feel is it's a lot harder to create something than to edit something. And so we figured we would do the creating for you, and then you all could use this as a starting place and then edit. The main thing I will point out is that we wanted to hold the existing system harmless. So if you were able to be in a classroom teaching now, we wanted to try to construct it in a way that would allow that. That being said, I think already there are some things that would need to be exceptions to the tiered system. So there are some areas that you can't have a teacher preparation, that there's no teacher preparation program for currently. Like I believe Hmong language is one of those, but yeah, okay, I'm getting nods from Board of Teaching staff. So thank you, Board of Teaching staff. So there is currently no way to get to go through a teacher preparation program in Minnesota and get a license to teach Hmong language. So, there are a couple of areas like that maybe wouldn't fit in this model and would have to get tweaked somehow. But I would urge you to limit those exceptions and those tweaks, because I think once we go down that path, we start heading down right back to where we are now.
Thank you. Sure. Any other questions? Senator Clausen. Okay, Senator Kent, then Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Clausen. Ms. Randall, just a quick question. Could you maybe just go a little more into your thoughts about the why it's not a good fit to have the K-12 NDE and the teacher prep part in the same bucket?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Kent. Right now, the way the teacher preparation program approval process works, and I'm sure the Board of Teaching staff could provide more detail, is they work with kind of outside folks. They bring them in and they go visit teacher preparation programs, and it's an approval process. So it's saying, yep, check, you're meeting our standards. There's a lot of standards in law that have to be provided through these programs. And so there's this oversight role of these programs that are located in colleges and universities. And, the Department of Education's jurisdiction is K-12. And so it's just a little awkward. It just seems like a little bit of an expansion of their jurisdiction and their authority. Can you expand it? Of course you can, right? You can do that. But it's just starting to move a little bit outside of, I would think, the department's core responsibility. Now, I think on the other hand, people might say, who better than the agency responsible for K-12 education to make sure that the things we care about that are happening in a K-12 classroom, that we make sure the teachers coming into the classroom know about those. So there's a fair counter argument. I know I just kind of argued against myself, but I think that's a fair point. But I think it's cleaner to have it in Board of Teaching. And given what we saw, and the confusion and the complexity, I think one of our driving goals when we were making our recommendations was to streamline as much as possible.
Ms. Randall, Senator Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. I know it was not in your charge to look at BOSA, the Board of School Administrators, but it's a very similar situation. I'm wondering if that entered into your conversation at all as you were doing your work, and if you have any recommendation there. And then my second question is that there are certain functions of the department that fall within the licensure. I've talked to you about this before, the STAR report, for instance, and there may be others that I'm not aware of. So if someone is from the department, it would be nice for them to maybe come forward and just review that, if there are any other functions that kind of are in the department that will need to be done in the future, regardless of where the licensure lands. And so those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Clausen. Related to the Board of School Administrators, we did talk with them, and we did consider kind of how they fit into this governance system. Because for those who don't know, right now there's a licensing division in the Department of Education. And that licensing staff licenses teachers, and it also licenses school administrators. And then there's the Board of Teaching that handles kind of policy and standards for teachers, and the Board of School Administrators that handles comparable duties related to school administrators. So it's a very parallel structure, and they kind of share this licensing division staff that's technically in the department, and they all are physically located in the same space at the Department of Education. So it's kind of a blurry lines in terms of who's responsible for what, but the chains of command are different in that the licensing division staff report up through assistant commissioners, eventually to the Commissioner of Education. So when we were looking at the problems that we were seeing with teacher licensure, naturally we wondered if the same problems were present for school administrators. And based on conversations with stakeholders and with BOSA, Board of School Administrators staff, it seemed like the answer was no. That BOSA is smaller, there's fewer school administrators, and that they have a system that works okay. And so they're not facing the same complexity and the same problems that we're seeing with teacher licensure. That being said, we did have in the discussion related to governance in our report, we kind of threw out as a third option. So we, talked about should all the responsibility go into the Board of Teaching? Should all the responsibility go into the Department of Education? We fleshed those out, and then we say, there's this third option where you could create a kind of master educator licensing board that rolls in teachers and school administrators. And you could put all of those people into one entity. You would solve some problems, likely create some others in terms of board composition and, are you having school administrators dealing with the disciplining of teachers? So you'd have to work out some of that. And one of the reasons why it was appealing is because, as you know, frankly, there's a lot of baggage around the Board of Teaching and just that name, the Board of Teaching. And so creating a new board might help to kind of do a fresh slate. So the BOSA kind of got rolled into the discussion, not because we saw problems there, but maybe because it could be part of the solution. I know, as you know, during the summer and interim with the study group, I think that idea was explored. I think the consensus was that people were moving away from that, but nothing's done till it's done. Related to your second question about the STARS report and other responsibilities that kind of come in the intersection of Department of Education responsibility related to schools and then related to teachers and teacher licensure. I don't know of other responsibilities, so the department will have to speak to that. Related to the STARS report in particular, my understanding is that the STARS report is a report about school district compliance and making sure that it is hiring teachers who are licensed for the right, that they are hiring licensed teachers for those positions. And so in my view, because it's compliance of school districts, that responsibility would stay with the Department of Education, and it wouldn't go to wherever you move teacher licensure responsibility. Certainly, there would have to be some coordination still. I mean, certainly whoever's issuing the STARS report or looking into those compliance issues will need information related to teacher licensure, but I don't think that's a compelling enough reason to either keep teacher licensure in the Department of Education or move STARS reporting responsibility to the board if that's where teacher licensure responsibility landed. Does that make sense?
Ms. Randall, just one kind of follow-up question. You talked about the standards and ethics. It's also fair to say that function could reside within the Department of Education as well, creating an advisory panel to the commissioner or whoever she designates to take on that function. Did you look at all at maybe because you've got a lot of different models where you've got a no standards board, maybe talk about the differences between from a comprehensive standards board to an advisory standards board?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the differences between these different standards boards, and this is something that the Board of Teaching might have a better handle on. If you look at page 89, the way the National Association, which is So there's the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification. That's a mouthful. They kind of created these classifications of the states with these different boards. And the difference for a comprehensive standards board, as we say there, is that a comprehensive standards board, such as the Board of Teachers, is responsible for all these different things: educator standards, education program approval, program accreditation, so it gets back to the teacher prep program, certification, and educator discipline. And so as you move along the spectrum, the board becomes responsible for fewer and fewer of those, basically. You know, I don't know that any one model is perfect, and I'm sure every model has a different set of problems, right? And so, you know, we can make all these changes to solve the problems we found, and certainly in 5 years there are going to be a couple of new problems, but hopefully they won't be as big as what we have now. You know, to your point about couldn't discipline be handled in the Department of Education with an advisory group, absolutely. You know, absolutely it could be. I think for me, the stumbling block there is, and now you have an advisory group. And so now already you're starting to divide up some of the responsibility. And so, you know, where we saw problems with having two entities responsible for things, you know, I understand it would be in an advisory group and still under the department, it starts to get things more complicated again. And there's a part of me that just thinks, here we go again, you know, just to be candid.
Just to follow up, Ms. Randall. So if I think about the Board of Teaching as constituted today, certainly the commissioner is accountable to the governor. And I'm just curious, do you see that clear accountability with the Board of Teaching under its current structure?
Mr. Chair and members, I think it's a fair question, and it's the one that has come up repeatedly related to the board and related to any board. I mean, we had the same conversation a couple of weeks ago related to Purpose Center for Arts Education, right, which is also governed by a board, and there were problems. And so, you know, I think oversight and accountability for these boards rests in a couple places. One, it rests with the governor making his or her appointments. It rests with this committee in confirming those appointments and having hearings and doing oversight. It rests with our office as an ongoing office, you know, an office that provides ongoing oversight. And it rests with the people who are supposed to be served by those boards. So it's not perfect. But I guess I would point out that, you know, over the past couple of years, it's the Department of Education has been responsible for a lot of the teacher licensing issues where there have been problems and concerns. And I'm not sure that the legislature has gotten the accountability it wanted in that model either.
Well, thank you, Ms. Randall. And I guess I'm thinking more structurally than I am based on the people involved.
Sure.
And that's maybe what I was seeing a lack of, where we have a direct line of responsibility back to the governor and his administration. This seems to be a little bit of a hybrid between an independent versus an administrative board.
Mr. Chair, our current board is that, or our current system? Yes. I would agree. I mean, I think the starting point is pick one. Just pick one, and then you can build in some lines of accountability. But as long as you have two entities who have real responsibilities, you know, related responsibilities, and so you have two entities, both with real responsibilities, but then a lot of confusion about who's responsible for what. You end up with, honestly, a lot of finger pointing and a lot of confusion. And so, I mean, I can't recommend strongly enough that the legislature consolidate these responsibilities into one entity, whatever that entity may be.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Ms. Randall. I appreciate your time and your presentation. And I'll invite Ms. Doan up if she has any thoughts, or are there any questions from the committee as well? Ms. Doan, I might just ask you for some introductory thoughts if you would.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Erin Doan. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Teaching. Thank you for the opportunity to offer a few comments. I would just start by saying, all along the process of the audit, I think Ms. Randall would probably agree that it was a little bit strange to arrive on scene and have us say, we're so glad you're here. Certainly, she describes not just the kind of blurred lines and how frustrating that can be for people on the outside, but also the blurred lines and how that causes frustration in day-to-day operation when everyone's trying to do the right thing. So certainly, as you read in the back of the report, and a little bit, it feels like it may be old news to some of you who we've spent a lot of time talking about this. But really, both entities, certainly the Department of Education can speak for themselves, but both entities agree that choosing one consolidated effort is the best way to go, and there's really no argument on that point. A couple of other things just in response to comments that have been offered today. The first one, I just wanted to point out in terms of this idea of does a standards board live outside as an independent board, or does it live inside an agency, and what does that look like in terms of looking at the standards boards that exist across the country? And the biggest difference that I think you'll find is that for those states that issue licenses, teaching licenses out of their Department of Education, the majority of those states also have a Board of Education rather than a commissioner structure the way we have here in Minnesota. So that's one of the defining characteristics, is that you're looking to a different type of board rather than an independent standards board. So something to think about. Beyond that, I just wanted to offer a couple of updates that have taken place since the time of the audit. One of those is that there was a change in the way that the Board of Teaching receives their appropriation on an annual basis. As of July 1st of this past year, the board now does receive a direct appropriation. So that was a positive change as a result of the audit and helped to clear up a number of fuzzy lines between the department and the board. Beyond that, the Department of Education worked very closely with us to draw up an interagency agreement to, again, iron out some of those understandings about our operation. For those who have been closely tied to this conversation, one of the issues in language that's in statute is that there is language that directs the Commissioner of Education to provide support for the board's activities, but that's not very clearly outlined. So in terms of our interagency agreement, working closely together to figure out what were things that that the department was able to offer us on an economy of scale sort of issue, and what are the things that the board actually needed to appropriate funds and to reimburse the department for services that we were receiving. So that has also, I think, been a very positive change since the outcome of the audit. Beyond that, I think I just want to add, for those who have been following the tiered licensure conversation over the course of the summer, that we have been working very closely with a number of education stakeholders to make sure that we're able to get some broad agreement on what the crucial pieces of that tiered licensure structure will look like. I think there are two clear places where disagreement still occurs at this point. One would be on that very first level that Ms. Randall referred to as sort of the equivalent of our current community expert permission, that currently that is a permission. There are still some that believe that that should not be a license in the state of Minnesota, that that should be titled in some way, that that represents an exception. In addition, the tie to teacher development and evaluation as part of a licensing structure is probably the link where there is the most disagreement broadly. Beyond that, the Board of Teaching does have recommendations for a tiered licensing structure that has really found broad agreement. So we're happy to present that information at any point that it would be helpful. And then lastly, there has also been a career and technical education licensure task force that has been operating, and I think that this committee has already heard from that group, and we've been working very closely with the co-chairs of that particular task force to make sure that their ideas are represented both in our recommendations for a tiered licensure structure as well as in our current rule drafts that are still moving forward. And with that, I will certainly stand for any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you. You answered my I had a two-point question, and the one was on career tech. I remember last year when Senator Dames had brought forward the discussion, I mean, of the career tech concern that we have in the state of Minnesota, and now that our higher ed institutions are not necessarily educating folks to go in the correct career tech field. So it's good to hear that that process is going forward, and that I hope you guys are having a combined conversation. I guess my question then, so thank you for answering that. And I know Senator Pratt, you and Senator Clausen, and I don't know if who else was part of that discussion, but on the licensing discussion, there was a huge decrease over a number of years in the amount of folks going for a licensure. And I thought the numbers were like from 2,000 down to 400 in like 1 year, and new folks that wanted to get a new license within the state of Minnesota. You're shaking your head. So did you continue that conversation? Was that all part of this big structure? And if so, is that all going to be kind of blended into this deeper conversation? Because the end result is, what are we going to have that's going to look good for teachers and for the students in Minnesota? And so I don't know if that's a fair question to ask now, but as long as we were on that, I just wanted to know if you guys, if that was something that was brought up within the committee, and are you going to do something?
Well, it's not a fair question, Senator Hoffman. So, actually, Senator Hoffman, it was Senator Uyghur, Clausen, Dahl, myself, Dames, and Housley that sat on the working group. In your packets, and I'm going to go over it here in just a minute, there should be a summary of the working group's outcome. I don't recall specifically talking about numbers of licenses processed, but maybe Ms. Stone, I don't know if you recall, or does that sound familiar to you?
Mr. Chair, Senator Hoffman, I think as I was shaking my head, I'm wondering if the senator is perhaps referencing information that may have been released recently with the Teacher Supply and Demand Report that is produced by the Minnesota Department of Education. I don't know that as part of the Teacher Licensure Study Group, we covered that information.
Mr. Chair, and thank you. I don't know. I just remember I heard that, and I'm wondering where to cite that from. And so if you just cited it for me, then I'll need to go back on it. But I just wanted to make sure those 2 points were covered, and it sounds like there was a lot of people in that conversation. So, Mr. Chair, thank you for that, and I appreciate you giving me the 411.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Ms. Stone, I might just ask you for a quick update. I know last summer about a year ago there was some concern around licensure by portfolio. You had a conversation here in Ramsey County with a judge, and if you might just give a quick update on where we're at in proceeding with licensure by portfolio and particularly the contempt of court order.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. As far as the licensure via portfolio process is concerned, that was something that was taken a look at as part of the legislative audit, so you can certainly see there are recommendations or findings there. Beyond that, the Department of Education worked very diligently in the fall of, I'm trying to put the right year on things, I believe the fall of 2015, in reestablishing the licensure via portfolio process. And the Educator Licensure Division has staff that are working on that issue currently. Curiously, the conversation, as we put it, in Ramsey County that was happening about the portfolio process, the judge's order actually came after the portfolio was already back in play. So still some communications to clean up, probably in terms of the understandings that were happening in that setting. In terms of where the portfolio process is right now, certainly it has been running since that time, and I can't give you direct numbers for the number of people who have been licensed via that pathway, but certainly the Director of Educator Licensing could provide that information for the committee.
Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Stone? Well, thank you very much for your time. Members, we're running just a little bit ahead of schedule, and I thought it might be good just to walk through, and if you don't mind, I'll do it from the chair's position, just to walk through the recommendations from the licensing governance working group, or I guess the legislative study group on educator licensing. And I do want to thank Senators Uyghur, Clausen, Dahl, Dames, and Housley. I thought we put in a lot of time. We met in person with our House counterparts. We were trading ideas and proposals. We continue to collaborate. Members, Senate File 4 is right now kind of a shell bill that we hope will put forth a broad plan for restructuring teacher licensure along the lines of these guidelines. And right now, I think it's just working out the details. So, members, I just wanted to kind of review these recommendations very, very briefly. And I think what you heard from Ms. Randall and Ms. Doan is we came to I think a unanimous consensus that we should have one point of accountability, and that the entire process should be housed under one entity and create effectively a one-stop shop. The second was that, and you heard it from the legislative auditor as well, is that the Board of School Administrators, or BOSA, should continue to remain a separate entity. We have a lot of work to do in just giving the Board of Teaching teacher licensure process the chance to make the reforms, and we've got a merger between the department and the Board of Teaching, whichever way it goes, and rather than worrying about trying to bring in a third partner into that merger, we should let them get their work done. As well as we've had, few concerns with the Board of Teaching, that we do, in fact, move forward to a tiered licensure system, and we put that tiered licensure system in the statute. I think one of the questions we have, and someone asked me, well, how much do you want in law? And my answer was just enough. We don't want to, we want to put the construction of teacher licensure, a tiered teacher licensure system in law, but not so tight that we don't allow our experts to reflect and react to the marketplace and the teaching environment as it is. The fourth recommendation was to make sure that we took into account the career and tech ed within the teachers licensure, and specifically and recognition of industry-related professional credentials and verifiable work experience. So oftentimes we talk about, I think we all at some time talked about the auto mechanic who wants to come in for a couple hours and teach auto repair. And in fact, Senator Clausen actually supervised one of my high school friends in Rosemont High School, who was, I believe, teaching electronics repair at the time, but had a wealth of experience that he was able to bring to those students and maybe even help them and encourage them from a real-life perspective to pursue a career. But it's really, what I walked away with was the fact that we valued that experience and the skills that those folks bring, and recognizing that we need an alternative way to certify teachers within that future tiered licensure system. And then finally, that we should go back in and clean up and standardize the conflicting statutes that we have, so that we're all working from one common set of definitions. And with that, I'll, without any warning, offer Senator Clausen or Senator Dames any thoughts or perspectives that they had from the working group.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, and I think the part that, of course, I have a lot of interest in is the vocational piece of that. And I think that at the end of the day, we're going to come up with something there that's going to be workable and acceptable, and I think that that's going to be very important, especially in rural Minnesota. So I thank you for allowing me to be in the committee, and I think we did do some good work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we did a good job of developing guidelines and what we need to do now. We've got a framework. We need to fill in the framework with more specifics. And I think your point about, especially with the tier license, how specific do we get? Or do we provide some general guidelines for what that tiered system may look like? And you and I have exchanged tier models back and forth over the last several months, and kind of refining our thoughts. So I think we're getting close, and I think it's a matter of spending a few hours putting together a bill and identifying, too, where some of our differences are. I don't think we've really landed on the governance issue at this time. It's something that we need to continue to work on. I think we're good on the Board of School Administrators, that we believe they should be a separate entity. And then, again, we've got a framework for a tiered system. We need to provide a few more specifics, but at the same time, we don't want to give too many mandates in that area and allow some rulemaking to take place. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Clausen. Any questions regarding the work of the working committee? Okay, seeing none. Is there any other business that needs to come before the committee today? Senator Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to ask a question. I was waiting. I had seen Mr. Uni, I believe, in the room earlier. Just wanted to check and see, given that there's been a lot of discussion about the department today, if give them a chance to respond and discuss any of the things that have come up if he were here.
I saw Mr. Uni. I see Ms. Wee.
Sorry, Ms. Way, I did not see you.
Welcome to the committee. If you just state your name for the record, please.
Thank you. My name is Wayne New. I'm an assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Education. Thank you, members, for the opportunity to speak. And again, we would like to thank Ms. Randall and her staff and the Office of Legislative Auditor. I think, as Ms. Doan mentioned, nobody really loves it when the auditor comes to your agency, but they were always very professional. They spent a lot of time talking to our licensing staff, talking to the Board of Teaching, and we really appreciate the thorough nature of the report. And we do agree that with the recommendations that they did provide, and the department has been working towards trying to implement a lot of those recommendations. As Ms. Doan said, we have entered into interagency agreements to really try to also decipher what should the Board of Teaching be doing and what should the Department of Education be doing. And I think we've worked a lot more collaboratively over the last few years to also try to streamline and update the process. The report also mentioned our outdated online system and our website, so we have been working on trying to put more information up onto our system. We just posted some frequently asked questions document and some guidance for candidates as well, to help them work their way through the licensing process, because we did hear in the report that it is very confusing for candidates to navigate the system. We've done what we can with our online system within the budget constraints that we have, but I know that there were other recommendations that really asked us to really update our antiquated system. As others who might be on the Education Finance Committee has heard, we are working from a very, very old mainframe. Our online licensing system is built on top of a very old mainframe. And so it doesn't make sense to continue to try to tweak a system on an old mainframe. Recommendations from our IT experts is to start new and to start fresh from a different mainframe, because of things like the inability for candidates to upload documents right now. The mainframe that we have right now just does not allow for that to happen. So as hopefully, if the request for the mainframe is approved by the legislature, we would be able to, if licensing is still at education, we would be able to make some of those adjustments as well.
Senator Clausen, I'd like to ask, just to use chair prerogative for 1 second. So let's say you were to get funding for a new mainframe. How easily would that be if governance resided with the Board of Teaching? How transferable is that technology between the two entities?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I am not an IT expert, so I would not be confident in being able to answer that question. My understanding, though, is if we are starting from new, then we probably would not, and everything gets transferred to a professional teaching board. We wouldn't be building onto an MDE mainframe. It would be something new that probably the new board would probably own.
Thank you, Senator Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When Ms. Randall was testifying, I asked the question about the STAR report, and then I further asked, are there other things that cross over, so to speak, into the department's responsibilities that we're maybe missing as we're talking about a tiered license system, that responsibilities that perhaps should stay with the department, or responsibilities that should maybe transfer to an independent board? So I'd really appreciate kind of a review of that, and maybe you need to come back to us, I'm not sure, but I think that would be an important issue that we need to be informed on before we can make some decisions and recommendations.
Chair
So
Pratt,
thank you.
Senator Clausen, I do think, and I do agree with what Ms. Randall said, that because the STAR system is a compliance system, that it probably does make most sense for that to stay within the Department of Education. We also use the data from that system for funding programs. QComp, we use that information to be able to fund districts for QComp, for example. And I think there are some other things that we also use that system for. Other things that we should really consider if it should reside at the Department of Education or a different professional board are the various grants that the department currently administers. Depending on what the jurisdiction of that board would be, we have the Q grants, we have the new Grow Your Own grants, we have a couple of other grants that we do that, so it might be something for consideration within this body of who's the proper entity then to administer those grants. We also have a few reporting requirements as well. The Department of Education currently now reports the federal teacher shortage list to the U.S. Department of Education. We also produce the teacher supply and demand report as well. A lot of the data from that is shared data between the STAR system and the special permission system and other systems that Department of Education and the Board of Teaching share. So I think that's another one of those reports that we would have to look to see who the proper entity would be to do some of those reports. But we can come back with a more exhaustive list.
Senator Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would really appreciate that. I think the committee would as well, so we can look at some of those responsibilities and see exactly where they should fit or shouldn't fit. And I appreciate that if you could get back to us with just a brief written report. Thank you.
And Senator Clausen, I might just ask the department and the Board of Teaching to get together and talk about these very, very important questions as we develop Senate File 4, and maybe be able to come back with the chair and lead to discuss what those options might be. Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one follow-up to an area, teacher misconduct investigations is another area that I think needs a little bit more discussion as well. So if that could be included, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if there's not any more business to come before the committee, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you, members.